At the table, William, or Billy Murphy, a former circuit court judge for the city of Baltimore and current criminal defense attorney. Matt Welch, editor-in-chief of Reason magazine. Eugene Jarecki, director of the documentary The House I Live In, which looks at the failure of America's drug war. And Kathleen Friedel, author of the upcoming book, The Drug Wars in America, 1940 through 1973. So, Eugene, I want to start with you. I'm suggesting that in fact, this drug war has yielded nothing. Has it yielded something? What has it accomplished?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. For the people who are proponents of it, of course, they will claim that it's had an impact on crime or violent crime or the rest, most of which is not borne out by any evidence. It just sounds good to voters. The reality on the table is that, we've been at this, as it said, for, 40 years plus, 45 million drug arrests. We've spent $1 trillion over that time. And for what? We have 2.3 million people behind bars, the largest prison population in the world in hard numbers. And drugs are cheaper, purer, more available than ever before. And they're used by younger and younger people. It's a record of abject failure. So it hasn't achieved nothing. It's achieved catastrophe quite handily.
Right. And so in this sense, Kathleen, I want to ask, should we be excited about what we are hearing from President Obama? If we have been in a war that has accomplished so little, is this a substantive new approach that we're seeing?
Yeah, when I read the National Drug Control Policy document, I was cheered by certain things, but I was incredibly disheartened when I realized that the language and the framework that President Obama is putting forward in this document is eerily similar. In fact, in some ways, the exact same language as the Kennedy Commission in 1963 put forward when Jack Kennedy was looking for a whole new approach to drugs. And that language is, well, we want to be softer on the addict or the person who has a substance use disorder, but we don't want an all-out militant drug war. But as long as you're supporting a regime of prohibition, the kinds of promises that we're getting from the Obama administration and that we got from Jack Kennedy are very facile promises, and they can't be delivered upon.
It's interesting. I want to play this for you, Matt, and get your response to it. This is President Obama in Mexico, recognizing the kind of market relationship and international market relationship. Let's take a listen, and then I'll have you respond.
In the United States, we recognize our responsibilities. We understand that much of the root cause of violence that's been happening here in Mexico, for which so many Mexicans have suffered, is the demand for illegal drugs in the United States. And so we've got to continue to make progress on that front.
So what do you think?
I think he mispronounced prohibition of. Demand for, prohibition of. These are two very importantly different categories. I mean, the president has not, don't look at his actions. I mean, he said for 2 or 3 years now, we are no longer using the terminology war on drugs. Well, great. I don't like the terminology of war. I believe in what Wilco said. There's a war on war. Let's do it that way. But let's look at what he's actually done. He spends more money prosecuting the war on drugs. He has busted up more medical marijuana dispensaries by a lot than George W. Bush has. They're spending more money on drug interdiction in Latin America than George W. Bush did. So it doesn't matter. You can say,
why?
Let's do
I mean, so tell me why. I mean, if the rhetoric is, look, we recognize that there's a market-based problem here. We recognize that prohibition or the demand for illegal drugs generates more violence. Then why is this an administration that has taken this particular approach?
We don't really know, but I think there's two possibilities. One is just political cowardice. No one's ready to make that leap right now, especially the president, who, when he was running for president, was a lot more circumspect about the war on drugs. He talked about that as kind of a policy failure and these kind of things, but he's afraid to stick his neck out. But also there's institutions that have been built up over the last 40 years and even beyond 40 years. And those institutions don't want this thing to end because it's kind of a great train for a lot of people.
Right, they run structurally no matter sort of who's... I have this, I'm looking at your face, Judge, and wondering, are we getting something wrong here? Are we missing some aspect
We're missing the entire point.
All right,
it's prohibition that's causing the problem. And if we don't end prohibition, we're going to have this problem over and over, year by year by year. And to make matters worse, all of the institutions that are charged with enforcing prohibition are now addicted to the war on drugs.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so they have this huge prison complex which grows. The prisons even lobby for increased sentences. How perverse can that be?
Right.
And so we have all kinds of economic interests. The police departments are bigger and more powerful. The courts are bigger and more powerful. The prosecutors are bigger and more powerful. And this part of the war on drugs is going to be one of the most difficult things to scale back.
Yeah.
But if we don't confront prohibition head on, This is all just talky talk.
Right, because that's what I'm thinking is one of the things that the war on drugs is a job creator, right? It creates jobs in the sense of generating money for police departments, generating money for the prison industrial complex, taking a whole group of young men and women out of the labor market by putting them into prisons, right? So there's a way in which we might imagine that way. I might be getting that wrong. We're going to come back and talk exactly about these questions of policies and how race is also implicated in them when we come back.
Well, I think the signing of today's bill into law represents the hard work of Democrats and Republicans coming. This is a good example of coming together and making progress on something that people had identified as a glaring blight on the law.
That was former White House press secretary and current MSNBC contributor Robert Gibbs in 2010, on the day President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act. The act's purpose was to reduce the sentencing disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. So there's still a disparity, but it's gone from 100 to 18 for crack and powder cocaine offenses. In 2011, the U.S. Sentencing Commission voted to retroactively apply the act. That gave 12,000 prisoners, 85% of whom were African American, the chance to have their sentences reviewed and possibly reduced. In spite of that good news, the numbers of those incarcerated for drug offenses remains staggering. Of the 2.3 million people in prison in the United States, 25% of them are there for drug offenses. $70 billion is spent yearly on corrections and incarceration by you, the taxpayers. And while 14 million white Americans and 2.6 million African Americans report using illegal drugs, 38% of those arrested for drug offenses are African American. And on average, black Americans spend almost as much time in prison for drug offenses as white criminals do for violent offenses. With numbers like these, we have a long way to go to change the drug sentencing system, which is why I want to come to you, Judge. These disparities feel to me like a central part of the argument for ending this so-called war on drugs.
Let me give you an example. In my city, Baltimore, where we have very weak political leadership or non-existent political leadership on this issue, 98% of all of the arrests, investigations, sentences, you name it, are of black people, and more are of brown people. Now, this is typical of every major city where there is a substantial black population. And so the war on drugs in Baltimore, Cleveland, New York, Los Angeles, you name it, is a war against black and brown people using drugs.
And poor people. Yeah.
And poor white people don't get caught up in the net too much because there is almost no law enforcement effort at stopping white drug use anywhere in the country. Now, there are packets of methamphetamine addiction, but that's the exception that proves the rule. And so whites have to be stupid to get arrested for drugs in America.
Right.
But black people are criminalized routinely, and it's a hangover from the alcohol model in the white community. AANA. You can get treatment, you can get help. There's a 3 strikes and you're out policy on the job. It's all confidential, but blacks get criminalized. And so the problem then becomes they become unemployable. Their families are destroyed. Their children are no longer ready for education. Age rates go up, and the beat goes on.
Yeah, and I mean, and in part because of the federal policies that have been part of this, right? So if you have one of these federal offenses, you then can never live in public housing again. You can never get a federal student loan again, right?
Offense.
So, right, but I mean, but what we know, I guess, in part, as I'm trying to think through sort of what the Obama administration can do, so they can't intervene necessarily in what's going on in the states, but they could make changes in some of these sort of the X that remains on your back even after the end of imprisonment.
That's called the ban the box idea, where there's this box on employment forms you have to tick for the rest of your life that basically is a death sentence for you to enter the mainstream economy. So what happens to young people is a kid makes a mistake, just like we all do, but there's no margin of error for a young African-American kid who's in an inner city and makes that mistake. Now all of a sudden he gets a strike on his record, has to tick that box. He can no longer end up in the mainstream, so he goes to where? The underground economy, which is the only one that will have him. And then we step back and wonder why it goes that way, and we say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I mean, here in New York City, we have a stop and frisk epidemic, right? And it's become a national national embarrassment, and thankfully it's getting the attention in the courts that it deserves. Stop and Frisk has a program where we stop 700,000 people on the streets every year. 87% of them are young blacks and Latinos. 87%. Yep. You are 9 times as likely to get stopped on the streets of New York just by the cops willy-nilly if you're African American or Latino. Now, of that, we frisk half, so about 350,000 people a year. We only find that in 10% of cases, is there anything actually wrong? Does it lead to an arrest? In 90% of cases, the cop says, oh, you can go now. After you've denigrated this young person in front of their community, humiliated them in front of their school, their church, their housing project, etc. And then we wonder, pull yourself up by your bootstraps while we kneecap you every 45 seconds.
Well, and it gives great lie to the idea that this is a war on drugs, because, you know, like if you want to find drugs, I encourage all local police departments to go to their local college campus, right? Because there will be students there doing drugs. But we don't think of going to police privileged children in privileged circumstances, right? We just sort of say, as you pointed out, those are young people making mistakes. They're going to get over it. You know, we don't want to criminalize them. And yet, if you are making those mistakes in urban communities, in a black and brown body, then suddenly it's fine to criminalize you.
Exactly. And I think it's important that we be clear on this point, which is our incarceration rates reflect they're artifacts of our enforcement strategies. And something that my book traces is how drugs came from something that was policed to drug enforcement being a way to police, right? There's all kinds of ways in which our government is addicted to the drug war, and I keep calling for an intervention. And one of the most specific kinds of intervention we can make is calling on new ways for our police to conduct themselves, especially in the city.
It's also bad for public safety. I mean, if you think about it, if you preoccupy a police officer with sitting in his patrol car and racking up cheap, easy, petty, nonviolent drug arrests, well, that's out the driver's side window, and he can rack up many of those a month, and it leads to more overtime, more pay. Almost half a police officer's pay can come from that kind of mischief. Well, out the passenger side window, there may be a young person with a mental problem who's on their way to do something terribly grave in this society, and that threat goes completely unnoticed because there's no profit in it.
Right, because we're solely focusing. But the other kind of profit, I wanted to play, this is actually from your film, The House I Live In, because the other kind of profit is a political profit, this idea that not only are institutions addicted to it, but that politicians are, that they don't want to be the one first person to jump out. So I want to listen to this and then ask you your response, Matt. Let's listen.
Nobody can afford to be the first guy to say, wait a minute, we can't afford what we're doing, let's do something different. Because if you even made a noise like you were going to be soft on crime in any way, you would be out of a job.
You will be put away, and put away for good. 3 strikes, and you are out.
Right, that's the guy who grew the prison industrial complex in this country, in part because of this fear of being soft on crime.
Oh,
and
yeah, and he said
time,
nobody would ever be harder on crime than him. Yeah, but go ahead.
But that era of politics is over, if you think about it. For Bill Clinton, it was a way to be a new, third-way Democrat. I'm not like these old soft on crime Democrats.
I am not Jimmy Carter.
We don't have that need for differentiation right now. There isn't a big, tough on crime groundswell happening. If anything, it's kind of the opposite, right? If you see 18 states now have medical marijuana regimes, this is hysterically popular in this country. It polls at 70 to 75%, right? We just have Colorado and Washington just legalized recreational pot. We now have a majority of the country believes that marijuana should be legal. And the war on drugs is a war on marijuana. That is the drug that people use, right? And so you have all of this happening this way, and you don't really have this impetus to show your bona fides anymore. So now it's a question of courage. Who has it?
Okay, we're going to come to exactly that. I'll let you jump in, Judge, because I want to talk about this idea of states as laboratories as soon as we get back.
But the problem is that the media landscape is changing so rapidly. You can't keep up with it. I remember when BuzzFeed was just something I did in college around 2 a.m.
That was President Obama at last week's White House Correspondents' Dinner, joking about his past pot smoking. While federal officials are still deciding what they will do, state-level officials in places like Colorado and Washington, 2 states that have legalized the recreational use of marijuana in 2012, continue to lead the decriminalizing charge. On Thursday, Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley signed a bill that makes Maryland the 19th state with a bill legalizing medical marijuana. So we have the kind of states as laboratories, but we also have international examples of what might work here.
Yeah, my eyebrows kind of shot up when I looked at the ONDC document this week, because it begins by talking about Sweden's unsuccessful experiment with drug legalization in 1965, but it leaves out the giant elephant in the room, which is Portugal's very successful with decriminalization, which is distinct from legalization. The very successful experiment going on in Portugal right now with decriminalization. And the results there show that experimentation with drugs did go up, but addiction and substance use disorders in populations of special concern, like young people, prisoners, or already known addicts, went down. So it's a very successful experiment underway, and it's one that we should be taking more seriously, especially because the world is taking that experiment very seriously.
And that's also hard drugs, by the way. That's heroin we're talking about, too.
Right, this isn't just a marijuana thing, but explain, I mean, just for folks who are watching, the difference between legalization and decriminalization.
Sure. 10 years ago, Portugal decriminalized, meaning they took the criminal penalties out for possession of all drugs across the board, up to a certain point. Up to a certain point. But the hardest drugs you can imagine, those are no longer illegal in that country, all the way up to a certain point. This was a decade ago. Beyond that point, they think you have enough quantity, you're probably a dealer, we've got special laws for you. But for the mass of the population, those who in this country are overfilling our jails, they said we're going to stop arresting and putting these people away. And instead what we're going to do is have a huge savings by dropping our criminal justice workload. And we'll take just a portion of that savings to institute one of the most robust treatment systems in the world. The results have been AIDS rates went down, drug use rates among the young went down, violence rates went down, and of course that criminal justice workload is such a huge savings for the country in hard economic times. You would think it would speak volumes in this country, where I believe we need to move from prohibition, which is a failed idea. Remember, we failed it at once before.
Yeah, we had to repeal that amendment, yes.
It's like trying to look like your high school yearbook picture. It's a tragedy. So we don't go back. We now look ahead and we think to ourselves, what would we do better? And the answer is, what did we do with alcohol? We tax and regulate it. It's an imperfect system, but it is a controlled substance. A child cannot be sold it. A grown-up has to use it responsibly. The government has an ongoing role. I don't like legalization, frankly, because I think it gives the government a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. The government has botched this and destroyed communities for 40 years, ruined the lives of people. It has a job to act as an actually responsible figure in a public health crisis, which is the crisis of addiction. He talked earlier
so to affirmatively engage, to be involved. So not just take your hands off of it, but to affirmatively engage. You break the point about money. I think that's useful. Let's look at what the drug control strategy money, this 2013 drug control strategy money, looks like. So this is from whitehouse.gov, and they say that the administration is doing its part to further the principles both at home and abroad. They've rebalanced the national drug control policy to reflect the complexity of drug use as both a public health and public safety issue. That's all great, but then look at this part. Dedicating more than $10.5 billion to prevention and treatment, compared to $9.6 billion for domestic law enforcement. These are huge numbers. We talk about this sequester and this deficit all the time, but we're spending billions.
Yeah, and treatment, that treatment number also means drug courts. Drug courts aren't necessarily, here, let's make you feel better. It is, here, let's give you random drug tests for a really long time, and if you don't show up for that random drug test, you're going to go to jail. So it's a lot more harsh than it initially sounds. And you're right, we are spending this much money. We're committed to it. Joe Biden invented the concept of the drug czar. I mean, we have this built-up kind of system here, and we need to, right now, say, okay, there are experiments happening in 2 states here. Let's let them experiment right now instead of continuing to enforce this. And it requires the same kind of courage as actually Joe Biden and the president had on gay marriage 1 year ago, right? They went out a little bit further than they were comfortable in going, and suddenly the world opened up for them and said, cool.
It was kind of stunning, right? And I'm wondering, Judge, if one of the ways that this courage sometimes can happen is that you start getting cover from other folks. So part of how Don't Ask, Don't Tell, for example, occurs is that you end up with the general saying, actually, ending this policy would be good for the U.S. military. So I'm wondering, Judge, if there's a way in which, on the one hand, you've got Americans, 53% saying that they would support the legalization of marijuana, but also if we need fraternal orders of police, if we need judges in the courts to give cover in order to generate some courage for our public officials?
Well, the problem is that most of the police chiefs in America are appointed by the very elected officials who don't want to talk about the problem because they have their eye on higher office. And the perception is that this is a black problem. The perception is that blacks are the violent ones. The perception is that we've got to control these blacks in inner cities. And until we deracialize this problem, we're not going to really make progress, because there are going to be lots of white folks who are not affected by incarceration who are going to be happy about the marijuana prohibition being ended. But that doesn't translate into black folks getting out of jail and having their problem treated as a medical one rather than an incarceration one. And so the 800-pound gorilla in this room is race.
Right, because there's this predisposition to already seeing black and brown bodies as criminal, and as violent. And as violent, right.
And you see the justification that everyone uses in the black community for fighting this so-called war on drugs, which is really a war against black people and brown people with drugs, is violence. And you see, violence comes from the difference in market strategy in the black community compared to the white community. Blacks sell drugs by the dose. That creates territorial fights because it has to be done on street corners, can't be done in stores. And so when you have competition, it's visible, it's notorious, and the only response that's capable of making a dent in your competition is a violent response. And so here we have these very desperately poor people in the black community who can only go out and buy one bag at a time, one pill at a time, who do it in the streets, and then that becomes the violent arena.
Can I answer that first?
They are going to make me go, but I think this is a critically important issue. You guys got to come back, because unfortunately I have to go to commercial, which I hate. I've got to stop with this commercial pain for the TV show situation. But thank you to Judge Murphy, Eugene Jarecki, and to Kathleen. Matt is going to stay around for more. But up next, we're going to shift a little bit to a shockingly different kind of war on the nation's homeless.